interfere with critical vehicle function.
Welcome to Future Thinking episode 153. My name is Alexander Schotten. This episode was a particular joy for me. I had the honor to talk with Jacob Howland, and we started with LSD, talking about it that is. We went back to the steam engine in ancient Greece to return to the 20th century's nuclear bomb and today's artificial intelligence. What a great range of topics, all in the idea of trying to understand the interplay of the human condition with ever more potent technology. What constitutes progress, education, and how can we deal with the challenges of our time? Jacob Howland served as Provost and Dean of the Intellectual Foundations program at the University of Austin from 2022 to 2025, and before that as McFarlin Professor of Philosophy at the University of Tulsa. He's the author of 5 books on Plato, Kierkegaard, and the Talmud, and over 60 articles on literature, politics, and the academy for general readers. He will be a distinguished visiting professor in the School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas during the academic year 26 and 27. Before we dive into the conversation, allow me a quick remark. This podcast is largely in German, but I have a growing number of English episodes with great guests such as Jacob. You can filter for English content on the podcast website. You also find references and quotations there, for instance from this episode. I'm sure you will enjoy this show as much as I did. Please support me by recommending this podcast to friends, family and colleagues, or share it on social media. Now, without further ado, here's the conversation with Jacob Howland. Jacob, thank you so much for taking time for a conversation.
Thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to it, Alexander.
I would like to maybe start with how I, so to speak, came to you, because I heard a conversation that you had with Jordan Peterson, and in this conversation, I don't even exactly know what it was about all in all, but there was one part of it where you talked about, I think, innovation and new things, and there was this one sentence that you said, I think it was about LSD, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit how this story went, because I think it's quite interesting to kick it off, where you said something to the effect, this is potent stuff, what can we do with it? It's sort of maybe you could just tell this story first, because I think it's a nice introduction into the question how we handle innovation as humans.
Sure. Well, thanks. As I recall, I actually don't recall the exact context of this particular remark, but I ended up telling Jordan Peterson a story. I had read a book with a title, something like LSD, the FBI and You, or something like this. And in this book, they related that actually it might have been the CIA, come to think of it. I think it was the CIA. But in any case, the Americans had discovered, there's this very potent substance called LSD. Yes, in fact, it was definitely the CIA. And they got their hands on this in the 1950s, and they said, well, this is very powerful. It's a very powerful drug. And how can we use it? What can we do with this drug? So they initially tested it using their own agents, by the way, and to see if it could be a drug that agents could ingest if they were captured and they were interrogated, and this would prevent them from saying anything, revealing any secrets. And they tested it out, and they realized LSD doesn't really do that. It has certain psychoactive effects, but it doesn't prevent people from revealing secrets. So then they decided, well, maybe we can use it conversely as a drug that we administer to individuals that we capture, that we want to interrogate, and see maybe if this will actually make them more inclined to share secrets. And it turned out that wasn't the case either. And I think this was in the context, if I recall now, of a discussion of sort of the human tendency to get their hands on some kind of means, some kind of powerful means, and try to figure out what ends that could serve, which is backwards, I think, from what one might call a sort of natural or certainly traditional way of reasoning, which is to determine what the ends should be and then to search for means.
Yeah, that was exactly the part that fascinated me, because you talked about LSD in that case, but this sentence, this is potent stuff, what can we do with it, had sort of rang for me as like a very general pattern with practically every innovation that you could describe, or at least the major ones over the last hundreds of years, I think, or of course, on occasion you had the case that had a problem, you solved it, but very often people came up with something, electricity or steam engine or what have you, and they just, as you said, they just thought, okay, what can we use it for, right? And it's quite interesting because it's not intuitive, essentially, for many people, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some reasons for this, and perhaps we'll talk about it a little bit more in our conversation. And it goes back to really the foundations of modernity and the introduction, let's call it, of the program of technology. And here I'd like to make a distinction between technical capability, which the ancients had. Human beings have always had technical capability ever since they picked up sticks to throw at an animal or something, and technology. And technology is really an invention of the early modern thinkers, particularly, I would say, Francis Bacon and René Descartes. And I would define that as the marshaling or harnessing significant social resources for the explicit purpose of advancing and applying science, particularly applied science. So there's more to be said about that, but what that orientation resulted in was a focus really on the mastery and possession of nature, as Descartes puts it in the Discourse on Method. And with that, the attempt to enlarge the sphere of human power, right? I mean, every technological advance is whatever it accomplishes is an increase in the power that is at our disposal to do something. And what that does is it puts the focus now on means rather than ends. And for various reasons, ends kind of get lost. One might put it this way, the phrase, the end justifies the means. Mm-hmm. Well, in this case, we have a reversal, which is the means justify the ends. And what I mean by that is we can do this, therefore we should do it. What prevents us from doing it? And I think that's illustrated very nicely, as you suggest, by this story about the CIA discovering, wow, this is really powerful stuff. What can we do with it?
By the way, because I mentioned the steam engine before, that just reminded me to a very interesting historic coincidence. You need to be in the mindset, or the innovation has to fit somehow in the mindset of the time, no? Because when I ask people when the first steam engine was invented, most people say 16th, 17th century, something like that. But in fact, the first steam engine was invented, I don't know exactly when, but before Christ, like the ancient Greeks had it. Do you know this story? They had a machine that was called aeropile or something like that. Essentially, they had a metal ball with water in there that was heated up, and like a pipe that was bent, and like when steam came out, you can imagine it started to rotate.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, they even used it for a party trick, so to speak, to open the doors of a temple. But the point being now is, I mean, you create this machine, you open the door of a temple, but you do not go the step further. Maybe I could use it for pumping water or something like that. So this was just like a one-off trick. So the time was not ripe for that particular idea, as it were.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. There is in Xenophon, who was a student of Socrates, there's a discussion where Socrates remarks to somebody who's very interested in technical capabilities. He says, well, what do you want to do? Do you think you're going to control the weather or something like this? And the point of that utterance is, well, that's ridiculous. Why would anybody even think about that? Whereas obviously today, that is one among many things that we're thinking about. But I think if I can go back to the sort of development and introduction of the project of technology, what this does is it really changes our perspective on the world and on ourselves, because the pre-moderns, the ancients and the medievals, and certainly both within the Greek tradition and the biblical tradition, were much more moderate or restrained. And they looked at the world as a place that human beings were by nature open to, that we could contemplate. Obviously, in the biblical tradition, you have God. God creates the world. The world is intrinsically good. In the Platonic tradition, you have the good, which is the image of the sun, is an image of the good. But when you get to the early moderns, the world begins to have a different aspect. And that is that it's really neutral, because Descartes and Francis Bacon look at the world and they don't say, man's highest end is the achievement of knowledge for its own sake, the contemplation of the goodness of the world, and so forth. Rather, the end becomes transforming the world in accordance with our desires. And see, I think this is very, very important, because desire, as both the ancients and certainly Descartes as well understood, is implicitly infinite, right? I mean, the point of the Discourse on Method, which Descartes wrote in French in 1637, not Latin, because he wanted to sell this idea of technology, is that we could develop an infinity, as he says, of devices for our comfort, for our enjoyment, and so forth. What is the thing that drives technology? Well, it's what you want. And as I mentioned, in Plato's Republic, he talks about how, when we take away the limits of desire, we open up an unlimited desire for wealth, or in the case of the early moderns, an unlimited desire for new devices and conveniences and so forth. So that really shifts the relationship between man and world. And then human beings are conceived as potentially gods. Because Descartes actually says in the Discourse on Method, if we become masters and possessors of nature, we may in fact find the way to eliminate the infirmities of old age, that is, to extend their lives completely. And one little signature of this is that both for Francis Bacon, who was also an early modern who was very interested in achieving the kind of knowledge that gives you power, and for Descartes, they both alluded to the 6 days of God's creation. Francis Bacon, in the New Atlantis, he has a college of the 6 days works, which is scientists who are investigating how to control nature and so forth. And Descartes, his Discourse on Method and Meditations had 6 parts in imitation of the first 6 days of God's creation. So the idea here is that we could become as gods through the capability of calling it to being whatever it is we want. And then what that means is that the end, what determines the ends, is then almost just taken for granted. It's really, what is it that you would like to accomplish? What is it that you will give you enjoyment, or will give you comfort, or will give you convenience? And that, I think, is a very important shift. And that's why I think we begin searching for means, because, we're not sure how it might come in handy. One day we wake up and we say, I'd like to do that. What are my resources?
But there's a very interesting double shift, I have the feeling. No, if I understand you correctly, you say, okay, with the moderns, there comes the idea we can change the world and we can change our fate to a certain extent, at least. We can change the future. And for that, we might want to achieve certain things. But then the double shift that I mean now is that actually when we observe how new things come into the world, how new technology comes into the world, more often than not, we don't exactly know what it does. Because this was like what you brought in with your example with LSD in the beginning, but it's many technologies. We start with something, but okay, what does it do in a systemic way 10, 50, 100 years later? We don't really know. And we see it with the whole IT development over the last decades. What does a service start with and what does it do 10, 15 years later? It's not really predictable, right?
Yes.
And this also, of course, opens the question that we have, and I think this was the big, let's say, break also after the Second World War with the atomic bomb. Suddenly, we had a technology that was unknown in its capacity and in its range and all of that, and could literally destroy the planet. We never had that before. And so you could ask yourself then, going back to the thing you said before, this is potent stuff, what can we do with it? We're a little bit like children in that way. So how on earth could we survive that? Would be a question that would follow from that, no?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this idea that you mentioned in an earlier remark, that we could control the future, we could take fate into our own hands. But what we didn't realize is that technology contains its own fatality, if you will. And today, I think it's quite obvious. Let's just consider artificial intelligence. You were just mentioning that we have nuclear weapons, and we're not, well, when nuclear weapons were developed, many scientists and others realized, this is something that we might not be able to control and so forth. So it has its own kind of fatality, if you will. But artificial intelligence is very interesting because we don't actually even fully understand how it works. And there have been many sober, moderate individuals who've said, we need to slow it down, we need to pause and so forth. Well, that's certainly not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because we're dealing with human beings and we're dealing with different states. I'm sure it's true that if we in the United States, for example, said we're going to have a moratorium on AI development, yes, other nations would proceed with it for their own purposes. So we're locked in this kind of, quote, arms race. And we're developing something that, honestly, we can't, how can I put it? We're going to have to trust AI more and more, but we don't actually know whether it is trustworthy because we don't exactly know how it works. And we're depending on it for a lot of things, including, for example, people are asking AI now, what are the ways in which somebody could hack into this website, like Firefox or something? And they pay teams of engineers to look at this. And, these guys human beings will come up with a few every month, like you could get in this way and this way. And then they recently asked AI to do it, and it said, here's 150 ways or something like that. But here's the thing. If AI knows how you can hack into a website, then it also knows how to do it itself. You see, yes. So we have to trust this, right? Like, okay, have you told us all the ways? Are you keeping something to yourself and so forth? So this is, look, the ancient stories warn against this. I mean, there's a story of Prometheus, Zeus withholds fire and Prometheus steals fire. And so there's this kind of conflict between human beings and gods. And then Zeus sends along Pandora. He invents women, and then Pandora's box, and you open it and you get something that's beautiful and attractive, woman, but she brings with her all these ills for men that fly out of the box, and that's actually a little myth about technology, actually. So we exchange one kind of fatality for another. And I do think that the human desire to become as gods invites negative fatalities. I mean, I'll just give you one more example. One thing about technology is I think it is both transgressive and totalizing. It's transgressive because it rejects limits. How does it reject limits to begin with? Why shouldn't we attempt to find ways to extend our lifespans, perhaps infinitely? Why do we have to put up with the natural limits of a finite life? Why can't we cure diseases? Why can't we do this? And to be clear, Alexander, many of these developments are extremely beneficial. I have family members, and my son wouldn't be alive without technological advances in medicine. Okay. But the problem is that, again, going back to both the Greek and the biblical traditions, the founding myths, if you will, both of the Bible and of Hesiod, the Greek poet, everything starts with chaos. Right? And what do you do with chaos? You create order, and you create limits. You create boundaries, right? Technology is intrinsically, we're going to transgress the boundaries. For example, I mentioned earlier that Descartes and Bacon mentioned the first 6 days of creation. The Bible says, by the way, there's a seventh day, and it's called the Sabbath. Okay. And if you violate the Sabbath, you will die. This is in Exodus. It's something like chapter 29. So I mentioned earlier, technology wants to violate, if you will, wants to find a way to transgress the limit between mortals and immortals, God and man. Well, why are these limits important? Well, because unless you can carve an ordered structure of boundaries out of chaos, which God does in the creation of the world in the Bible, then you're just going to have chaos. So one really has to ask, right? Today I think we live in an age where politically as well as technologically, we want to transcend limits. Mm-hmm. I want to say, I'm not happy with my biological sex. I'm going to, change my sex, or I'm going to do this or that. But if the idea is to remove all limits, which would be a way of being like God, right? Unlimited, utterly unlimited. Then because we're human beings, we're just going to descend into chaos. So there is a kind of fatality there too, if you see what I mean. You can take human beings out of chaos, but you can't take the chaos out of human beings. And when you have human beings who have chaos in their souls and you give them tremendous capabilities, then you're inviting consequences that you really didn't foresee.
You triggered a number of thoughts in my mind now. Let me just drop them on you, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can do something with it. The first is because you mentioned chaos. There was the very good book from Stuart Kaufman. I don't know if you know him, At Home in the Universe. He's like I think he's an economist or a physicist, and he did a lot with complexity research. And in At Home in the Universe, I think in the 1990s, he essentially discussed the question how order comes into place and what self-organization, these type of things. Anyway, and one of the phrases in the book was, the interesting things happen at the edge of chaos. So if you're too orderly, then it's just boring and nothing really interesting happens. When you step too much into chaos, then you get eaten up by the chaos. So on the edge of chaos, you balance, and then you find the interesting order, if you will. That was the one thing that came to my mind.
Yes.
The other thing that came to my mind was, you said we replace one, what did you say? Replace one maybe problem or risk with another. Yeah, something like that with another. And that reminds me again to a conversation I had with Jörn Norberg, who you might know by name. He's an economist, and he said in my conversation about risks new technologies has, he says, sort of, we are always fighting, I'm paraphrasing, we're always fighting to control the risks of the last technology and build on top of that. But he says, I rather like to live with the risks of the current technologies than without the current technologies. Because as you said, I mean, I'm always bringing the example to my students of the US President Calvin Coolidge. I think he was in the 1920s, if I'm not completely wrong, right? Something like that.
I think, yes. Mm-hmm.
And because for me, it's a fascinating story, because you might know the story that his 16-year-old son died on an infection after playing tennis because he had a blister or something on his foot, and died from this infection. And my point is, 100 years ago, not even the president of the United States, and he certainly had all medical tools or proficiencies at his disposal, could not save his son. So you could say, I'd rather like the risk that we have now, not the risks we had then.
Yeah, look. I mean, I certainly am glad that I live in the modern world with the technological advances that we have. At the same time, it's a rather fearful situation to exist in the modern world with the technological advances that we have. Let me actually mention two things. And so you were talking about the edge of chaos. This is very interesting because, look, there's sort of two forces in human life. We could call it the yin and the yang, or we could call it the Dionysian, and it's sort of and the Apollonian. So Dionysus is this god of intoxication and sort of natural vibrancy and so forth, and Apollo is the god of order and light, etc. When you just have order without the vitality that comes from, let's say, transgression or the removal of boundaries, or the vitality that we see, for example, in societies will have carnivals, right? So what's a carnival? It's when the limits are off,
Yes.
You can try on different things and so forth. If you just have order, you have decay, you have fossilized formalism. And actually, it's very interesting because, the Egyptian society for thousands of years under the pharaohs, they also wanted to master nature. They would embalm. They thought we could have immortality. They were attempting to, they did research into astronomy and mathematics and so forth, but they wanted to bring everything to a standstill. And that's kind of an excessive point of view. On the other hand, if you simply have kind of Dionysian, call it chaos. I mean, you have a sort of primal vital energy, but it can be very frightening and very destabilizing. We do need a mixture of these things. Human beings aren't very good at putting together two contradictory things and holding them in a moderate synthesis. But then the second point you were making, I think,
this was the replacement of risks, if you will,
yeah. So no, I mean, I think that we exchange certain kinds of risks with other ones, and but it seems like the epochs of human history are sort of like a pendulum. You swing too far in one direction, you swing too far in another direction. Today, our age is this also goes back. I think really modernity at the end of the day is a fatality, because it's modernity that says, look, everything that came before, the early modern thinkers with their mathematical physics and analytical geometry and stuff, it's baloney. It doesn't have authority, and they discover in quick succession, that the earth is in the center of the universe, and that, the Bible, Spinoza's biblical criticism, it wasn't written by God, etc. So now we can throw that stuff aside. We can forget about it. We're going to look at the future. and as I said, we're going to really change our relationship to the world as a whole. That initiates a fatality that really does replace the ancient. I mean, if you look at the ancient Greeks, fate was a huge thing in Greek tragedy. Can we eliminate the idea that there are forces larger than us that control us? Now, today, we don't believe in the gods who control our fate, who can make a man kill his father and sleep with his mother. But we do, in fact, have forces that are much larger than any single individual or any nation can control. And I think, that's where we are. Oh, I know what I wanted to say to you. Speaking about technology. Okay, so we both agree we like technology. We're moderns. There are many good things about it. But I don't know if you know about Henry Adams and what he thought about technology. So this was the grandson and great-grandson of two American presidents, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Henry Adams wrote a book called The Education of Henry Adams. And Adams had the following thesis. He said, I'm going to do a simple calculation and figure out how quickly we are increasing our technological power. And what he did is he decided to look at coal production and consumption from 1800.
So was this in the 19th century or in the 20th century?
This was in the 19th century. So his book is published in around 1910, something like this. But he was born in, he graduated from Harvard College in 1858, I think. So in any case, he looks at coal production and he realizes that every decade from 1800, it doubled. Okay, so this is his measure of the advance of technology. But what he realizes is, let's assume that the rate of acceleration is the same, which it may not be. For example, AI may be accelerating in terms of its capabilities more quickly. The curve will be the same, but it's going to get very, very steep at some point. And what he argued is, when it gets very, very steep, the change is too fast for human societies. And it can be fundamentally destabilizing.
Mm-hmm.
And my example for this is, if we knew, now we have the war with Iran, so we don't know what the price of oil is going to be tomorrow. If we knew that the price of oil would be $2 higher every year, we would have plenty of time to get used to that.
Mm-hmm.
The price of oil went up to $500 a barrel tomorrow. That's too fast. We can't adjust. This is particularly worrisome in the age of AI, because what is AI going to do? Well, it's actually going to put a lot of people out of work, probably, create other work, okay, fine. But it's going to cause massive disruption, which is also going to cause political disruption, let's face it. And that's not anything anyone can do about. There's nothing we can do about that. We're going to have to adjust. So then we put stress on the human capacity to adjust in ways that allow us to maintain our fundamental freedoms and decency of existence and so forth.
That's very interesting. I would like to add this to something you said before, and maybe change a little bit to the question how we discuss progress in society. And because you said we have a hard time holding two opposing thoughts in our head or something to that effect. And I would like to extend this maybe as a question, because I'm discussing this topic for now, meanwhile, years. And I found it very interesting that, let's say, climate change, for instance, was like for the last 20 years in self-declared progressive cycles, the Antichrist probably, right? Like to make also a little bit the leeway to Peter Thiel maybe. Anyway, I don't want to discuss about climate change. I want to discuss about something more fundamental. So there was this one problem, and this one problem was like, if we solve this, we have solved everything, so to speak. Like this was like and whatever it costs, we have to solve it. But in fact, when you look at it, I just made the exercise for myself. I mean, you could easily come up with a dozen or so technological or societal risks that could become existential, and very quickly existential. AI is one of them, but there are a large number of others, like large-scale grid failures, for instance, in Europe. Imagine like you have a week or a month no electricity in half of Europe. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people, and probably how long does it take to recuperate from that? So I easily come up with a dozen of such things, and climate might be one of them. Fair. But what troubles me is that we seem not to be able to have the bigger picture in mind, but immediately fall onto one that seems to be like a poster boy. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You mentioned progress, and maybe I can start with that notion. So it's actually very interesting because I've been a professor for a long time. I started teaching in 1988, at the University of Tulsa. And at that time, students would speak very positively about progress.
Mm-hmm.
And their assumption was everything is progressing, everything is getting better, the new is better than the old. I don't hear that as much anymore.
Exactly my point, because I also grew up in the 80s,
Yeah.
and we were like, and you had like the Star Trek stuff from the 70s and all of that. And I mean, we were afraid of the atomic bomb. That was definitely a thing. But as you said, also from my childhood, remember, we were very much interested in the computer and this and that and that. And it was like, had a positive connotation. Exactly.
Yeah. And so setting aside this fact that our attitudes toward progress are adjusting now, I just want to point out that if we go back to modernity, modernity is a self-conscious rejection of the past, but it's also related to what I would call, let's say, the influence of Christianity. Okay, so Christianity comes on the scene and it says there is an arc to history. It's divine history, but there will be an end of days, right? So we're going somewhere. Now, if you look at somebody like Descartes or Francis Bacon, they say, well, there's an arc to technology. And at the end of that, right, we're going to be the masters and possessors of nature. We will be as gods, right? Now, that is a secularization, if you will, of the Christian story, but it still assumes this notion of progress, because progress is there in Christianity as well. And then, of course, we get things like Marxism, which is another kind of secularization, a political secularization of Christianity, right? We are going to, heaven will be here on earth and so forth. This, I think, is very, very much in our bloodstream, our mental bloodstream. Like, we still think this way. Only now we're a little bit worried about, well, what is that end going to be? Is it going to be some kind of apocalyptic thing? Is it going to be, the Star Trek future, right? And so that's one thing. But now the other thing is that why is it that we grab onto something like climate change? I mean, I think here what makes that so attractive as something to focus on is, well, it's a problem in nature of our own making, and we can control that. We can figure out a way to reverse this. And there might be technological things, right? Like wind power and solar power, blah, blah, blah. There might be political things and so forth. Moderns and late moderns, us, believe that we can solve problems. This is another part of the kind of assumption of the Cartesians and the Baconians and the early moderns. Every problem has a solution, and these thinkers tell us, I mean, Descartes says, break every problem into its parts, think about it analytically, work up, So we're very attracted to those kinds of things. Now, of course, the one problem that we haven't figured out, which turns out very strangely in the end to be much harder than material nature, is human nature. And I mean, totalitarianism is an attempt to solve the problem. And it's an attempt to solve the problem by technological means and so forth, but surveillance and so on and so forth. So it's a kind of application of science to the political situation. But we haven't been able to deal with, just to go back to an earlier term, the infinity of human desire. I mean, people are not rational animals. Economists will say, well, a rational consumer will do this and so on. But everybody understands this isn't exactly how people work, And we have our own criteria for what we regard as valuable. It may just be rebelliousness too. Dostoevsky's Underground Man. He's like, if somebody could show that human beings are just, machines and here's the correct solution to our problems, we would probably just rebel because we want to be free.
But this is very fascinating that you said it, because I think this is really one of the issues that we have today. There's a problem, we find a solution for it. In the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, I'm reading more and more books or texts that are from the, let's say, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And what so baffles me is that many of the good ones, you read them and they could have been written yesterday.
Yes.
Because it is so clear what they describe. And the situation did not change over 60 years, clearly. And I mean, Thomas Sauber said there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And essentially, this is a thought that goes back to Hayek from the 40s, I would say. So exactly this idea, Then there were the wicked problems described in the 60s. So actually we know since at least 60 years at least, that in a complex environment, you cannot solve a problem. You can live it, you can try to change things, but then you have trade-offs. But this seems to be completely lost with a large number of people. They really believe, oh, here's a problem, we know it, we solve it. No, you don't. At least in my opinion.
Yeah, but really this goes back, Aristotle's excellent book, The Nicomachean Ethics. He begins and he says, look, you have to understand what is the domain in which you're trying to solve a problem. So his example is if you ask an arithmetician, what is 6 plus 6? And he says, well, it's roughly 15. This is not good. This is an exact science. You give an exact answer. It's 12. But you should not expect arithmetical precision on political questions. I think this is also part of our understanding of politics is deficient because, let me give you an analogy for the way I think that politics works. It's like owning a home, okay? If you don't paint the wooden outside of your house and your windowsills, there's going to be decay. If you don't fix things, there's going to be decay. You have to keep putting energy into the system. Actually, would you want to live in a home that you didn't have to maintain? It'd be made of like some kind of steel that had no corruptibility or something So, yes, I mean, we've lost the understanding. Even, by the way, somebody like Max Weber, he says, politics is the slow drilling of hard bores. All we can do is to arrive at temporary accommodations. By the way, they're never going to be morally perfect. That's another thing that we've lost, is that, political justice is one kind of thing, and absolute strict moral justice is another, and we can't confuse them. So we just have to keep putting the energy in. There's a kind of impatience here. And I've been thinking recently that this, I think, is part of, like, even people who are complete atheists realize that, we're in this kind of historical stream, and they've become impatient, just as perhaps religious believers may be impatient for the end of days, or Cartesians might be impatient for the complete mastery and possession of nature. So we see all these problems, and we want them to be fixed, and we don't understand why they can't be. And that's because we don't really understand enough about what it means to be a human being and live in the world. Maybe we don't have enough humility. That's another thing that gets lost. I mean, if somebody said to you, here's Descartes, and he says we could be the masters and possessors of nature, and we might not even die. By the way, the whole religious tradition is irrelevant. It's not as if you're saying we don't believe in God. It's like, who cares? Because we are now, as Freud said in Civilization and Its Discontent, we are prosthetic gods. We can put on all of our equipment and so forth. It doesn't matter. Well, the Greeks would have called that hubris. They would have called that overweening arrogance. And so, by the way, with the Hebrews and the Christians. So, yeah, I mean,
but also the thought that we are being hubris. Do you call it hubristic in English?
Yes, hubristic. Yes, yeah.
Hubristic. Yeah. So that you have a lack of humility is also an idea that Karl Popper wrote about this from the 60s, 70s constantly, that we lost humility in science, for instance.
Yes.
And by the way, because you mentioned the problem again, and what I find fascinating also is the way we deal with problems is partly really very unhealthy, as it seems, because again, I come back to, I read there's a book or a collection of articles from 1958 with the title "Is Progress Possible?" And one of the articles is from C.S. Lewis. And I don't want to go into much details here, but it's interesting in so far because C.S. Lewis, on the one hand, is troubled about the atomic bomb and the possible effects it has. And there's a number of other articles into that are very good. But then he makes one point that I found extraordinarily illuminating for me for this time. And he writes, I'm more concerned by what the bomb is doing already. So to young people. So what he means by that is, of course, the bomb is a threat, but if we stare at the bomb and completely lose ourselves by staring at this threat, the bomb destroyed us already.
Yes.
Before it even exploded. And a similar situation we have now is with climate change. We stare at it and we do the most inept things, like what Germany and UK, for instance, did with the energy politics. because you're so afraid of climate change that you rather destroy us now?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's funny you say that, because I remember when I was young, I was in college, and I wrote a letter to the New York Times, which they didn't publish. And I've seen, last time I saw it was years ago, but it was quite juvenile. But I made exactly this point. I said, because at the time, and you may recall this as well, but so this may have been, let's say 1978, something like this. We were very worried about the possibility of nuclear destruction. And
nothing
letter
changed until now, by the way. We just don't
Yes.
talk about it anymore.
We don't talk about it. Yeah. And that's what's so strange. But at the time, it was a very sensitive topic. And the argument of my letter was, we're already, exactly your point, we're already being affected by it because it was already affecting our future. Now, if you think about this, this is a really difficult situation for young people today. Because, again, going back to Henry James's point about how quickly things are changing, what's the future going to be like? Can I plan? What career is going to not be susceptible to being taken over by artificial intelligence? How can I plan? And this is a side effect of technology that's very disturbing, and it can produce all kinds of pathologies. By the way, when we're speaking about sort of this hubris, Richard Feynman, the great American physicist, had a great definition of science. He said, I believe it was science, but anyway, the quotation was something like this. He said, when he was talking about science, he says, science is a belief in the ignorance of experts. Okay. Now, what did he mean by that? What he meant is, I think you can interpret this positively. You're dealing with a scientist, a real scientist, when that scientist says, here's what we don't know.
Yes.
Okay. This is the very limited sphere in which I can speak with authority. Contrast Anthony Fauci, who basically said, I am the science, right?
Yes.
I am the science. Well, you mentioned Karl Popper. I mean,
and by the way, even worse, he said in an interview, and who attacks Tony Fauci attacks science. I mean, that's a sort of hybris, would you not say?
That's exactly. And so, you look at Karl Popper, and I mean, Karl Popper's great. He says, you can't, because we're still addicted to talking about the laws of nature and so forth. And Popper would say that's just an as yet unfalsified hypothesis. Okay. So, I think that it's very strange because we're very proud of our accomplishments, let's say, in understanding the universe. But of course, our understanding of the universe is limited by the speed of light. We have a very tiny, what we can understand and see is extremely small. So, and the point isn't to make us doubt everything, by no means, but not to be so unhumble, not to be so hubristic. And again, from the biblical perspective, they would look and say, well, what are you guys doing? This is totally crazy. So, yeah, it's.
I would like to sort of follow that up what you said now, maybe by shifting the topic a little bit to the question of maybe what is the role of philosophy in all of that now, and also maybe even goes beyond philosophy, because one of the real issues that I have over the last decades, aside of the increasing quality issues that we have in science, is this hyper specialization. So we have, years ago, I had a professor at a seminar, and he told me afterwards, what we're doing today is we have people who drill extraordinarily thin holes that are relatively deep, and then they sit on the bottom of this thin, deep hole and feel like the king of this hole, right?
Yes.
But they have no idea what's going on, how this is connected. And I was always sort of a fan of, if you will, generalists to a certain extent. It's like a connecting tissue of these things. And my first question would maybe be, do you agree with this assessment? And secondly, have we lost the generalist? Because you always hear, you cannot know anything, you have to specialize and so on. But who is connecting that stuff in the end?
Yeah, excellent question. I heard this expressed this way. People these days know more and more about less and less. And if you draw out to the logical conclusion, someday we'll know everything about nothing. Right? So,
exactly.
Look, I mean, there is certainly a very important place for specialists. Okay? I have great respect for somebody who understands batteries and the limitations on, how can you construct a battery that's going to be light enough to create an electric powered aircraft, and what's the, all the issues involved and so forth. But there has to be, like, the most important understanding is that which fits us to understand things as a whole in some way. Let's sort of look at this question. What is it to be a human being? I think it's to be concerned, among other things, with being able to answer a question that shows up in both Plato and the Bible, and that is, where have you been and where are you going? In other words, was my life, let's think in terms of your life, okay? By the way, modernity is the opposite, because modernity, the Latin word modo, M-O-T-O, means, M-O-D-O, means just now, right? What is just now? So the emphasis in our lives today is on the present, on what is happening right now. But to understand yourself as a human being, I think, is to understand not just what I'm doing now, but where am I going, right? Where have I been? And that way you sort of connect yourself with a larger narrative, your ancestors, and ultimately you can expand back and look at the beginning of things and try to understand. If you can understand where you've been, you can understand where you're going and so forth. That requires generalization. The problem with generalization, and it's a problem in the academy, by the way, is someone will come and say, but Alexander, you're not an expert,
Exactly.
Incidentally, it's actually very strange because, so the American Civil War, it turns out that there are many, many thousands, tens of thousands of amateur historians who collect materials from the Civil War. They understand things, and they have made some of the greatest contributions to the understanding of the American Civil War. And, the fact that, I'm sorry, you don't have a PhD in American history and you haven't graduated from an Ivy League university, that's irrelevant. So it's very easy to kind of say you don't have the credentials, you don't have the specialization. Now, maybe I'm just making excuses for myself because I've never let my ignorance interfere with anything I want to study, No, seriously. And I mean, and so I think that there's something to be said for being an educated amateur about many things. And being able to kind of get this larger vision. I think specialization is, militates against that often. But let's not forget what education is for, because if you looked at education from a characteristically modern perspective and you said, well, what's the purpose? It's to gain the kind of knowledge that gives you power, technical power, political power, and so forth. Okay, then fine, maybe specialization, right? Because that's where you really get it. That's like, if you understand quantum mechanics, you can do quantum computers. Now you've got something really powerful. But if the aim is to live a decent, elevated, good, flourishing human life, then you need to understand things that are not really matters of specialization and that may not actually produce precise and exact knowledge. Like, what is it to be a human being? So, and that's what philosophy should concern itself with, it seems to me.
You said something very nice. I looked back into my bookshelf, but I didn't find it immediately. Anyway, it's not important. You said something to the effect you don't let ignorance get in. How do you say it?
I said, like, I never let ignorance get in the way of something I want to study or
exactly,
something like
because
that.
I would really like to make a statement even bolder, because there is a very fascinating book, What is Life, from Erwin Schrödinger. I don't know if you heard about that. Erwin Schrödinger, physicist, Nobel laureate in physics, quantum mechanics. So he was one of the founders, if you will, of quantum mechanics. And then he wrote, it must have been in the 30s, 40s, I'm not 100% sure now, a thin book, which is called What is Life?
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And if you read nothing, just read the introduction. In the introduction, he says exactly that. He says, I'm going to make myself, or people ridicule me or something to that effect, because I'm stepping way beyond my expertise here. Because in What is Life, he actually drew a program of what is life and how is genetics working, stuff like that. And if you read this book today, you of course realize that many of the things that he described are not correct anymore. However, if you read of all of the greats from the molecular biologists of the 50s, 60s, Watson, Crick, and like the 8-10 others in Cambridge, practically all of them say, Schrödinger's What is Life motivated me to dig into this question. And he was wrong here and there, but this was what drove me to get a different perspective on the problem and what brought me to the feet. And they made unbelievable achievements,
Yes.
scientific achievements. And my guess would even be go so far that because we have not a lot of generalists, we have such a stagnation in science in large parts.
Oh, this is absolutely the case. So I'll give you an example. Kepler, who established the law of the movement of the planets, he said, so you have an ellipse, the planets go around, and they sweep out equal areas in equal times. Okay. He was inspired to try to figure this out by reading Plato's Timaeus. Now, Plato's Timaeus is a very interesting dialogue in which you have a kind of scientific account of the universe, something like this. But the idea was, and this is the point of the Timaeus, is that there is a kind of harmony. Okay, if we look into the natural world, we are going to find mathematical and even musical harmonies. Like things aren't simply random. And so Kepler said, I thought about this, and I said, well, the planets must have some kind of order, some kind of thing. So I could give you other examples. Copernicus writing about the sun, being in the center of the solar system. He said, I was inspired by Plato's account of the good, which he compared to the sun. And I thought, if the good is like the sun, and the good is central to human existence, then maybe the sun is central in a way, physically, right? So what I'm pointing to here is, and of course, in both cases, Plato might have been wrong or something like that, and he didn't know that the sun was in the center of the solar system, but they were inspired by these big kind of thinking, right? And I think that this is really, really important. And I also would say, Alexander, that, I'm very interested in the points where you have these kinds of intersections. So, for example, Plato twice compares the individual soul to an irrational number, okay? And he even says at one point, politics is rationalizing the irrational souls of human beings, right? These are very rich and interesting images, and they make you think, about these things. And there is something in mathematics. I mean, when you're looking at like the slope of a curve, how is it that these things are calculable? How is it that there are these kind of nice harmonies? So that produces a kind of almost subconscious intuition, if you like, that I think has been very important for scientists over the years.
Gosh, I have so many more questions on my mind, but I want to be respectful with your time. Just maybe round it up with one question that is also very important to me. In one of the articles, I think, that I read about you, or that you wrote, I'm not 100% sure now, is because you were also, how should I say, very instrumental in changing or building up new universities or building curricula and that sort of thing. And I think in one you wrote about your motivation. You said something to the effect of to save civilization, or what was the other one? The mission was to save America's higher education. Okay,
right.
And I would maybe, because you also mentioned the term education. So what exactly are we trying to achieve with our education now? Because my gut feeling is that we have universities and Ivy League universities that, I don't know, I don't think they're Ivy League anymore. Maybe there isn't. I don't know. Yeah. They are not. I think they lost the track to a significant extent. Then we have the AI topic. Now just as an aside, there's a Swiss philosophy program, and like some years ago, it was before AI actually. There was a philosopher, and she made the point, well, we don't have to learn things actually in school anymore because we can just look at Wikipedia. Wow. And I thought, what the? How can you associate something with something if you don't even know a rough idea of the world? I'm rambling, but I have to give you one more example. In my lectures, I'm regularly asking, my lectures are about science and society to a certain extent, aside of my software stuff. And I'm always asking students in the beginning, they should tell me what were the biggest inventions of the 19th century in their opinion, just to get an idea, just kickstart. You know what I hear in every course, at least one person saying? The internet.
Of the 19th century?
Yeah, so my point is, so when you don't know anything, you cannot associate anything. So, okay, sorry for my rambling, but my question would maybe to you, what do you think is the purpose of education today, especially also university education, or universities as a general topic, because I have a lot of experience there. And can we get out of this crisis that we're in now?
Those are big questions. Look, First, let me say there are multiple legitimate reasons for going to a university. One reason, of course, is to acquire a set of skills that might be marketable. Another reason might be to get the credential that shows that you've acquired those skills and so forth. But there's no question that universities are in crisis. And I think part of the problem, or maybe the root of the entire problem, is the sort of political invasion of universities. I mean, what is the purpose of a university? Well, it's to transmit knowledge and wisdom, which, by the way, our ancestors, who are never given enough credit, they struggled, they suffered, they wrote things down, they transmitted it to us. And incidentally, Alexander, you talked about the steam engine in ancient Greece. It's very clear that all kinds of technological progress has been achieved and lost over the years.
Mhm.
Right? So there's that. Okay. But so the transmission, the preservation of knowledge, this is another thing that universities are very important for. There's got to be a place you can go, an institution that says, well, here's actually the status of the manuscripts by which we know Plato, or here's this or that. And then the extension of knowledge. Now, those aims are not necessarily completely in sort of harmony, because you can have a major research university that's very good at extending specific knowledge and specialization, but perhaps not actually educating young people. But one political function, I mean, as you know, this year is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in the United States. And it's very clear that our universities have had a negative effect, not only not a positive effect, a negative effect, citizenship. Large numbers of young Americans and now older Americans think that the United States is a horrible country, that there must be many better places, that we haven't accomplished anything, and so forth. This is not very good for citizenship. We want to graduate people who have a critical understanding, to be sure, but also a positive appreciation of the accomplishments of the United States, of the Constitution, of our laws, etc. And by the way, the founding fathers were very well versed in the tradition. It actually is interesting. I just learned the other day at a conference that the one book that the founding fathers referenced more than all other books combined was Exodus. Ben Franklin and
Exodus from the Bible.
Yep. Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson argued about what the Great Seal of the United States should be. They each had a different scene from Exodus because they thought of this, right? We're getting our independence from the British. We're going to the promised land, so to speak, the United States. We are building our own society, right? And so anyway, can you be good citizens if you graduate from a college and you say, I didn't get an education because all my professors thought the purpose of an education was to change the world, according to certain political activism. So I didn't actually learn a lot. I learned about social problems. I absorbed a great deal of negativity. I know everything that's wrong with the United States. And I've gone out into this country and I don't have any sense of really who we are or why we should have borders, or what the vision of the United States is, or why the Constitution is important, or why laws are important. These are just general things. So there's the political side, but there's also for the individual. It's very sad to me. I look at students, and little children ask 100 questions a minute, and they're very curious. Why is it not the case that we can give students the education that will make them excited?
Yes.
Thrilled. By the way, Henry Adams said this. This is very interesting. In his book, The Education of Henry Adams, he said, Harvard College, and by the way, it was a college then. It wasn't a university. It was just 100 people a class. Harvard College taught little, and that little ill. That is, it didn't teach well. But, he said, it left the mind open, supple, and ready to receive knowledge. How many universities can you say that about? People graduate and their minds are open, they're supple. That means they're not dogmatic.
Yeah.
And they're ready to learn. They're ready to receive knowledge. We have not succeeded in that. And I think that really is the primary task of education, both for creating happy and flourishing human beings, for preparing us for the tasks of life. And incidentally, another thing is, all this words are violence and so forth. We have to protect ourselves. As you very well know, because you're an adult, the real world is a punch in the face, and you need to learn how to take the punch in the face. You need to learn how to try, how to fail, how to try again, and how to fail better until you get it right. These are real world lessons. So let's teach people about the real world. But the world as a whole, the world is a big thing. It's not just an adversary. It's something that contains good and bad and everything in between. And if we can't give people this broad education that makes them competent in many situations and able to judge in multiple situations, competent at least to understand what you're saying. I don't necessarily understand quantum mechanics, but I need to be able to have some sense of what is that exactly? And I need to be able to judge people who make claims to expert knowledge. How do you get that without a broad general understanding? And just also the pleasure of learning. I think that's really important because at the end of the day, we're suffering from a crisis of meaning. Any way we can give people more meaning is significant. And if I can show them how beautiful poetry is, or literature, or how interesting history is, or how fascinating it is to struggle with philosophical questions, this is meaning. And to do so in the company of other people too. That's a communal thing too. And so that's rewarding and rich. Anyway, that's what I would begin.
Do you have this? I couldn't agree more, but my question would be, do you have this experience in your university or where you had it? Because my feeling is that this is largely lost. And that I would agree with you entirely that I would see this is the core point of a university.
Yeah.
And even if your core point would be to train people to do something, but there is the very interesting book from Brian Kaplan, The Case Against Education. You can agree or not agree with him, but I think he makes the point that like 80% of the reason why you go to Harvard or whatnot is signaling. So you don't know much more when you come out than before, essentially, but you get to know the right people and you signal with your degree. But that's embarrassing, right? If this is the case.
Look, I think things are changing. Here in the United States, it's interesting. We have there are sort of many initiatives. One is these schools of civic leadership or civic life. They're being installed in state universities. In fact, this fall, I'm going to be teaching at the University of Texas in the School of Civic Leadership. I'll be a professor there. And they are emphasizing the great books and the political tradition. So if you go to the School of Civic Leadership, you will read Tocqueville, greatest writer in the United States. You begin to understand what it means to be an American. You will read great books. You will read the ancient Greeks. You will read some biblical texts. You will read, and you'll focus then in with that broader context, law, let's say, or policy or whatever, but you're going to have this bigger understanding of the world. There are now, I think, 17 of these institutes or schools of civic leadership and life in 12 different states, and there will be more coming online. This is a revolution. This is a return, it's a return, like a revolution of the old set, a return to the broad understanding.
It's a reconstruction. It's maybe a reconstruction, as Douglas Murray would call it, no?
Reconstruction, right. And incidentally, I think that these institutions, so I'm in Austin, Texas. Austin is a very entrepreneurial place. Here in Austin, you've got, let's say, experts in artificial intelligence, computing, and so forth. They don't care what your degree is. They don't even care if you have a degree. They just want to know, okay, Alexander, show me what you can do.
Yes.
And I think that there are some good examples. There's a man named Alex Karp, who's the CEO of Palantir. Alex Karp, as you probably know, was a philosophy student. He came to Germany. As far as I know, he learned German. He studied with Habermas, who just died, wrote a dissertation in German, but he's also the head of this technology company, this very heavily reliant on computing and advanced technology and so forth. That's a good model because somebody like that has a philosophical breadth, thinks about what it means to be human. After all, what is artificial intelligence? It's supposed to serve us, right?
Yeah.
It'll probably master us, but it's supposed to serve us. Wonderful statement. So there's a school called St. John's College in the United States, and it's a great book school. My very dear friend, Pano Kanellis, who was the founding president of the University of Austin, where I worked for 3 years, told me when he became president of St. John's College, he ran into a young man. And he said, "Oh, you're a freshman. What are you here to study?" And he said, "Well, I'm really interested in computer science." And Pano thought to himself, should I tell this kid that we don't have computer science here? So he said, "You realize this is a great book school." And the young man said, "Oh, I know. He said, "But computers serve human beings. And I thought it would be a very good idea to know what a human being is first." Now that's the vision that I think everyone who is leading AI and so forth should have, that kind of education. Few do. Okay. Few do. But let's do that. Let's not throw technology out. Let's go ahead. Okay, it's here. Let's ask the real questions. What is it we're looking for? A good life for us. And by the way, those people have children. They've got families. They want what's best for them. So let's figure that out. Let's not neglect the political issues. Let's not neglect the social issues. Let's think hard and long about what happens if we disrupt work or we disrupt leisure or whatever it is. That should be the future. So the good news, Alexander, is that people understand the problem you've pointed to. There's a general recognition, except among those who have investment in the social virtue signaling and the credentials, that there is this problem, and people are taking steps to try to correct it. Whether it'll be enough, who knows? But we can only do what we can do. So we'll see.
This was a terrific, how should I say it? It's a terrific note to end with, because it gives some hope or some positive outlook. And I have to say, thank you very much for the conversation, even though I only scratched the surface of your knowledge at the moment. But thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Alexander. I really appreciate your inviting me onto your podcast. I'm looking forward to hearing it. So.